News of the Times. Catherine Wilson, Britain's female Borgia, the last woman publicly hanged in London. London, 1862. In a quiet house in Kennington, a woman named Sarah Carnell is recovering from a spell of poor health. At her side is her attentive nurse, a soft-spoken lodger known for her gentle manners and unfailing helpfulness. Her name is Catherine Wilson. One evening, Wilson brings her landlady and friend a warm, soothing draught, encouraging her to drink it down. Mrs. Carnell takes a sip, gasps, and spits it out. The liquid sears her mouth, and where a drop lands on the carpet, the fibres burn straight through. The chemist's analysis confirms the unthinkable. The drink contained enough sulfuric acid to kill 50 people. Mrs. Carnell survives, just, but the quiet, obliging lodger who prepared the mixture slips away into London. Police pursue, and when they begin to look into Wilson's past, a far darker pattern emerges. In Boston, Lincolnshire, a widow died after Wilson took charge of her medicine. A householder with £120 in savings dies days after Wilson learned of the money, and a lover collapsed in agony and landlady died within hours, and another woman perished after borrowing a small sum, money that vanished at death, along with Wilson herself. Again and again, the same symptoms. Again and again, the same soft-voiced companion at the bedside, and always the same quiet departure. Victorian newspapers soon called her the Female Borgia, a woman whose unremarkable appearance concealed a talent for charm, deceit, and the slow, deliberate use of poison. She was believed to be responsible for as many as 7 deaths, although only one could ever be proved beyond doubt. This is the story of Catherine Wilson, the last woman publicly hanged in London, a serial poisoner whose trail of death lay buried beneath the ordinary bustle of mid-century life, uncovered only when one intended victim refused to swallow the drink offered to her. And for our further particulars of the year, we thought we'd begin with something different. So naturally, we turned to the illustrated police news and to the odd, wise, and occasionally baffling foreign proverbs it printed in 1890. And now, from proverbs to poison. Settle yourself comfortably as we step into the lodging houses, sick rooms, and quiet stairwells where Catherine Wilson moved with unremarkable calm, leaving behind no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, and no dramatic escape, only grief, suspicion, and the long shadow of a woman history would come to call Britain's female Borgia. We start the tale in London, 1862. London, spring in 1862. Catherine Wilson, a quiet, unremarkable lodger known in the neighbourhood for her gentle manner, is taken into custody at Kennington on a charge so grave that news of it spreads quickly through the surrounding streets. Few can quite believe it. She had been assisting in the sick room, helping to nurse her landlady, Mrs. Sarah Carnell, through a period of poor health. But suspicion had hardened overnight. Mrs. Carnell had been offered a warm medicinal drink. Urged by Wilson to drink it down, she tasted it, immediately spat it out and cried out in pain. A drop of the liquid fell to the carpet and burnt straight through the fibres. The chemist, upon examining the remainder, delivered a stark conclusion. The bottle contained sulfuric acid in quantity sufficient to kill 50 people. Wilson denied wrongdoing, but the evidence was enough for the police to act. She was arrested and her rooms searched. And as inquiries began, investigators quickly found themselves looking far beyond the immediate case. The last known victim, Sarah Carnell, from the Broadsides, 1862. Catherine Wilson worked as a domestic servant, nursing the ill health of Mrs. Sarah Carnell. She made her will, and by that she, Mrs. Sarah Carnell, left a sum of money to Catherine Wilson. Catherine brought her a soothing warm drink, urging Mrs. Carnell to drink it, stating, "Drink it down, love, it will warm you." Mrs. Carnell took a taste and spat it out as it burned her mouth. It was noticed that a hole was burned into the carpet where the liquid had touched. Mrs. Carnell survived this murder attempt, and the police were called in. Tests were run, and it was found that the soothing draught that Catherine had given Mrs. Carnell contained sulfuric acid in an amount enough to kill 50 people. Catherine escaped to London, where she was caught and arrested. From the Weekly Times and Echo, London, 22nd of June, 1862. The vitriol poisoning case. Constance Wilson, described in the calendar as being 40 years of age and a widow, was indicted for feloniously administering to Sarah Carnell oil of vitriol so as to hereby endanger her life. Mr. Oppenheim addressed the jury for the prisoner and complained of the loose and unsatisfactory manner in which the facts of so important a case had been presented to the jury on the part of the prosecution. He argued generally upon the facts proved and submitted that they were far too vague and uncertain to justify the jury in convicting the prisoner of so serious a crime laid before her. Mr. Baron Bramwell, in summing up, told the jury that although the offence was charged in 4 separate counts varying in character, the simple question which they had to decide was whether they were satisfied with the evidence as far as the administering was concerned, and secondly, as to the intent of the prisoner. His lordship then very carefully reviewed the whole of the evidence at considerable length. The jury retired, and after an absence of about 20 minutes returned into the court with a verdict of not guilty. Despite the harsh summing up by the judge clearly indicating his feeling in the matter, to the surprise of everyone, Catherine was found not guilty. Her defence that the acid must have been given to her by mistake from the pharmacist cast enough reasonable doubt for Catherine to be acquitted. However, police had been busy, and Catherine was immediately rearrested for the murder of Mrs. Soames. Life and medicine in 1850 and 1860s England. Before we follow the murderous trail of Catherine Wilson, we need to understand the world which she exploited. In mid-century England, lodging houses were temporary, crowded, and largely unregulated. People fell ill easily. Poverty and poor sanitation were everywhere. Doctors were expensive. Chemists were trusted without question, and gastrointestinal illness was so common that even severe vomiting raised little alarm. Poisons like colchicum were sold freely. Sulfuric acid was used for cleaning, and forensic science, as we understand it, barely existed. It was the perfect landscape for a quiet killer, one who moved softly, spoke gently, and left no visible trace. Life in 1862 was unforgiving, particularly for a woman without family or fortune. In the villages of Lincolnshire and the crowded streets of London, survival balanced on narrow margins. Work was insecure, lodgings temporary, and reputation everything. A woman living on her own had little protection in law and even less in society. Respectability could vanish with a whisper, and poverty pressed close behind it. Illness struck quickly in damp rooms heated by little more than hope. Doctors were costly, chemists were trusted by necessity, and death in a boarding house was sadly unremarkable. People came and went. Neighbours knew little beyond a name, and those who cared for the sick were often believed without question. It was a world where quiet killers could hide in plain sight, and Catherine Wilson understood this all too well. Before the murders began, Catherine Wilson, who also called herself Constance Taylor, Constance Wilson, and Catherine Taylor, entered the world around about 1817 in the small Lincolnshire village of Surfleet near Spalding. Born Catherine Crane, she grew up the daughter of a carpenter who would later spend his final years in one of the town's bead houses, the charitable almshouses for the elderly poor. Her family was modest, troubled, and touched by tragedy. Of the three Crane children, one, described in the language of the time as an idiot, died shortly before Catherine's arrest, and both parents had been dead for more than a decade. Her first brush with notoriety came shockingly early. At 14, while visiting the home of family friends, she stole a valuable item from the household. The servant was accused, arrested, and convicted, largely on the testimony of young Catherine herself. Only later, when questioned again, did she confess that she had committed the theft and allowed an innocent woman to be punished in her place. Even at that age, she understood how to manipulate sympathy and escape consequence. After the scandal, Catherine left home and drifted into Spalding, where she fell into what Victorian reporters tactfully called a loose life. From there, she moved to Boston in Lincolnshire, where her charms and soft-spoken manners caught the attention of a respectable master mariner. She presented herself as a steady, refined, and marriageable. He believed her, and for a time they lived comfortably as husband and wife. But while he was away at sea, her old habits returned. When he came home and discovered how she had been living, he abandoned her. Catherine simply slipped into another name, another lodging house, and another life. Catherine had one consistent pattern. She attached herself to people who had money, and many of those people died. It was only after her arrest in 1862 that investigators traced her steps and stumbled into a trail of suspicious deaths stretching back more than a decade. Unable to secure a conviction from the Carnell case, the authorities had widened their inquiries investigating her antecedents. As they followed Catherine Wilson's steps from lodging house to lodging house, a grim pattern surfaced. She sought out those with money or comfort to offer, nursed them with apparent gentleness, and moved on only when illness, and too often death, had overtaken them. Once police examined her past, the deaths fell into place like scattered tiles, suddenly forming a mosaic. Wherever Catherine Wilson lived, someone suffered agonizing gastrointestinal illness, vomiting, purging, burning abdominal pain before dying. In the era before toxicology, the symptoms were easily mistaken for cholera or English cholera, but in hindsight they bore the unmistakable stamp of colchicum poisoning. The list of victims grew quickly. The victims. The Boston, Lincolnshire deaths. Victim 1, Mrs. Jackson, 1851. About the year 1851, Catherine Wilson was in the habit of visiting Mrs. Jackson, who resided at Boston in Lincolnshire. Catherine was aware that Mrs. Jackson had drawn from the bank in that town a sum of £120, value approximately £21,500 in 2025, which she had in her possession. Mrs. Jackson was taken ill with the same symptoms and died in 4 days. After her death, the money was nowhere to be found. Victim 2, Peter Mower, 1853. About the year 1853, Catherine was employed as a domestic servant to a person named Mower, who lived at Boston in Lincolnshire, and that this person was in the habit of taking colchicum. He made his will in the month of April, and by that will he left the whole of the little property he possessed. A gout sufferer in the habit of taking colchicum, a regular used treatment of tiny doses for gout. Large doses of the drug had a terrible impact on the body, stripping the lining of the stomach, relentless vomiting and diarrhea, and producing organ failure. One of the cruelest aspects of the drug was that the mind often remained clear. Many victims were fully conscious while their strength ebbed away, unable to speak or move as the poison took hold. Death came slowly, usually over a day or two, long enough for the suffering to be unmistakably yet easily mistaken for natural illness. Peter Mower, who clearly had great affection for Catherine, altered his will in Catherine's favour. His signature on the revised will was his death. He died in the month of October, some 6 months after signing his new will in Catherine's favour. His death at the time was believed to be due to a severe case of gastroenteritis. Whether coincidence or design, the pattern was now forming. The Lovers, Victim 3, James Dixon, 1856. Wilson's common-in-law husband. He died suddenly in London after vomiting and purging violently. She insisted it was consumption, but the autopsy revealed perfectly healthy lungs. Yet there was nothing untoward to indicate poisoning. Catherine collected what little estate he had and moved on. Victim 4, Mr. Taylor, 1861. A similar attack, the same symptoms, but this time medical help arrived quickly enough to save him. His survival left permanent lifelong damage to his health. Women with Money, Victim 5, Mrs. Soames's case, 1856. This widow owned a substantial property and let rooms to Catherine Wilson. She died in terrible agony, her symptoms matching those of the earlier victims. This was the murder for which Wilson would ultimately hang. Victim 6, Mrs. Atkinson, 1860. Another woman with savings. Catherine came to live with her, and within days Mrs. Atkinson fell ill and died. Had Wilson escaped conviction in the Soames case, this would have been the next prosecution. And of course, the victim whose murder attempt began the investigation into Catherine's history, victim 7, Mrs. Sarah Carnell, 1862, survived. The kind, helpful landlady to Catherine, who was almost never unwell until Catherine took lodgings in her house. The victim who survived. Acquittal on the Carnell charge brought Catherine Wilson no freedom. The inquiries made during that investigation had revealed a trail of illness and death behind her, stretching back more than a decade. Money borrowed, wills altered, medicines administered, and the same violent symptoms repeated again and again. Prosecutors were ready. As soon as she left the dock from her acquittal, Wilson was arrested anew on 2 separate charges. One newspaper account described the next stage of the case in these terms. From the Chelmsford Chronicle, the 25th of July, 1862, extraordinary case of systematic poisoning. On Thursday, Constance Wilson, alias Catherine Taylor, stands charged with having caused the death of Mrs. Anne Atkinson by poison and was placed at the bar at the Lambeth Police Office for further examination. A second charge was also preferred against the prisoner of having in October 1856 caused the death of Mrs. Mary Soames by the administration of poison. The medical evidence not being ready in the first case, Mr. Chipperfield called only one witness and then proceeded to open the second case. He stated that the late Mrs. Soames was the widow of a pianoforte maker residing at 27 Alfred Street, Bedford Square. She lived upon some property which had been left to her by her late husband, but the house being too large for her family, she let out part of it. The prisoner occupied the first floor unfurnished and had done so for 12 months, preceding the death. The deceased lady was of an extremely amiable and kind disposition, and the prisoner had succeeded in borrowing various sums of money from her. On the 10th of October, the deceased, who scarcely ever suffered from illness, was then known to be exceedingly in good health. On that day, Mrs. Soames went to the residence of Mr. Barnes, a draper at Holloway, and asked him for the loan of £10, obtaining £9. She returned home and took tea with her daughters and with Miss Rowe, who had lived with her for nearly 6 years and was regarded as part of the family. Late in the evening, the prisoner came downstairs and invited the deceased to take supper with her. Mrs. Soames went up to the prisoner's rooms, while Miss Rowe and one of the daughters left to sleep at number 13, another house owned and let out by the deceased. Nothing more was heard until the morning, when Mrs. Soames was found seriously ill, suffering from vomiting, purging, and other violent symptoms. A medical man was sent for and attended her. Miss Rowe saw the deceased only once that day. When she sought to visit her again on the Friday, the prisoner told her that the deceased must be kept very quiet and it would be better not to see her. Mrs. Soames died between 3 and 4 o'clock on the Saturday morning. Although suspicion had been raised at the time of Mrs. Soames's death, several important pieces of evidence had not been fully explored at the inquest. Miss Rowe later stated that she had seen a bottle of medicine locked away in the prisoner's room, and when she asked why it was kept there, Wilson replied that it was very particular stuff and that she alone must administer it. The attending doctor would deny ever giving such instructions. During the final days of the illness, the doctor visited several times, yet Wilson assured the household that Mrs. Soames was improving. When Miss Rowe offered to sit up through the night, Wilson refused for help. Conflicting messages were sent across the street to the daughters, first requesting their presence and then telling them not to come. After the death, Wilson took Miss Rowe aside and gave a very different account of the matter. She claimed that Mrs. Soames had formed a connection with a young man who had deceived her, and that the deceased had taken poison in Wilson's presence. It was, she insisted, not a natural death. After the death, Wilson continued to support her story that Mrs. Soames had taken poison in her presence. She told Miss Rowe that a letter would arrive in a day or two from the supposed young man, and that if it came addressed to the deceased, Miss Rowe was to give it directly to her. On the Monday morning, a letter did indeed arrive, directed to Mrs. Soames at Alfred Street. Although the deceased was still alive at the time it was written, the handwriting was later identified as that of the prisoner herself. The contents were as follows. Dear Maria, I hope you was not very hurt at my not being home on Friday. I was surprised to hear a lady in black wanted me. I can't let you have the £20 now, but if you will let me have £10 more, I will next Monday come to the corner. Don't say any of what you're doing to anybody. Send me word if you was not well after you got home on Wednesday, as you was unhappy in the afternoon. Direct this letter as the first used to be, for the old postman found fault in the street. Be careful and come Wednesday. I will be there. Write by return. Yours. This letter was produced at the inquest, but as the supposed writer could not be traced, no further inquiry was made at the time. With some of the initial evidence surrounding Mrs. Soames now laid before the court, the magistrate turned to the further matters uncovered during the inquiry. One of these concerned the death of a young man with whom Wilson had lived shortly before the Soames case, a death which at the time had raised little comment, but now bore a striking resemblance to the others. From the Nonconformist, the 13th of August 1862, the extraordinary case of the wholesale poisoning. On Thursday, Constance Wilson, alias Catherine Taylor, was placed at the bar before the Honourable Mr. Norton at the Lambeth Police Court for further examination on the distinct and separate charges of having caused the deaths by poison of Mrs. Anne Atkinson and Mrs. Soames. In the course of the proceedings, a third charge was ventilated in relation to the death by poisoning of a young gentleman named James Dixon, who died 2 months before Mrs. Soames, and whom it was proved the prisoner had cohabitated. The 2 daughters of Mrs. Soames and some other witnesses were examined, and at a late hearing the prisoner was again remanded. From the Shields Gazette, the 21st of August 1862, the extraordinary case of wholesale poisoning. At the Lambeth Police Court on Saturday, Constance Wilson, alias Catherine Taylor, was brought on remand, charged with having caused the death by poison of Mrs. Soames in April 1856, of Mrs. Anne Atkinson in April 1860, and of a man named Dixon with whom she had cohabitated for some time. The prisoner was now been for several weeks in custody. A lengthened report of Dr. Nunnally was put in and read, in which he detailed the analysis he had made of portions of the contents of the body of Anne Atkinson, and the conclusion he had come to was that death had not been caused by arsenic, but by some other irritant poison. There was an absence of any appearance of disease in the body to account for death. Arsenic administered in quantities could be discovered for 2 years after death, but a vegetable poison could not. Colchicum wine would produce symptoms such as the deceased had experienced, and it was a poison which could not be discovered after a short time. Dr. Swain Taylor was called, and his report to the death of Mrs. Soames was read. The result at which he arrived by analysis was that there was no trace of mineral or metallic poison. No vegetable poison could be discovered after a period of 6 years. What had been stated was not inconsistent, however, with the fact that the deceased might have died from some irritant vegetable poison, but the proof of that fact must rest upon other branches of evidence. Dr. Taylor said he could not form any opinion to the cause of the deceased's death. In analysing portions of the contents of the body of Mrs. Soames, Dr. Taylor stated that he had found no traces of arsenic, antimony or mercury. He should have expected to find traces of such poisons, had they been taken within 52 hours of death. The witnesses were bound over to appear at the sessions to be held on the 22nd of September. The prisoner was then remanded for the completion of the evidence. Although Catherine Wilson had walked free from the charge of attempting to poison Mrs. Carnell, her reprieve was brief. The moment she stepped out of the dock, fresh charges were laid against her for the deaths of Mrs. Soames, Mrs. Anne Atkinson, and the young man James Dixon. The inquiry now gathered speed. Dr. Taylor, the renowned pathologist, could not declare the cause of death with certainty. The suspected poison was vegetable in nature, and any trace would have disappeared swiftly after burial. Yet he expressed serious misgivings. With his reservations on record, the proceedings against Catherine Wilson advanced with renewed urgency. Following the renewed hearings, further evidence was brought forward. Two witnesses, Mr. John H. Biker, a builder, and Mr. John S. Heath, editor of the Lincolnshire Herald, both stated that the letter produced after Mrs. Soames's death, supposedly written by a young man with whom she had formed a connection, was in fact in Catherine Wilson's handwriting. Their opinion rested on the spelling, the formation of the letters, and comparison with her earlier correspondence. Adding testimony confirmed that Mrs. Soames had been in good health immediately before her sudden illness. Mrs. Riley, the charwoman, stated that she had once been sent by the prisoner to a chemist in Tottenham Court Road with a line written by Wilson and obtained 6 pennies worth of stuff, a small quantity of dark liquid. In the Atkinson case, it was noted that various articles pawned by Wilson before Mrs. Atkinson's arrival were redeemed during her stay and after her death. Another letter sent to Mr. Atkinson requesting pecuniary assistance and purporting to come from a servant was also identified as being in the prisoner's handwriting. After hearing this evidence, the witnesses were bound over and Catherine Wilson was committed on both charges for trial. The final chapter. The trial was an event in itself. To Victorian eyes, the notion that a woman outwardly quiet, respectable, and trusted in the sick room might be responsible for a succession of poisonings was unsettling in the extreme. The case was reported wildly, from London dailies to provincial weeklies, each attempting to make sense of the accusation that a figure of apparent gentleness had moved undetected amongst her victims. From the Shields Gazette, the 2nd of October, 1862, the case of wholesale poisoning by a woman. At the Central Criminal Court on Saturday, the trial of Catherine Wilson for the murder of Maria Soames was resumed. Mr. Justice Biles proceeded to sum up. He said the case was nearly ripe for the jury's determination. They had heard the address of the counsel on both sides, and he had considered the evidence, and had examined the points in favour of the prisoner, and did not find they had been omitted by either counsel. The judge reminded the jury that, should any tone in his address seem to reveal an opinion, they were to disregard it, for the responsibility lay with them alone. There was, he said, little reason to believe the deceased had taken her own life, as her daughter testified that she had spoken merely of a bilious attack and showed no expectation of dying. He called attention to the remark the deceased made after taking the medicine administered by the prisoner, namely that it was that horrid mixture after which she was seized with fresh vomiting and pains in the chest. He further reminded them that the deceased had left Mr. Barnes' house with £9 in her possession, which was never seen again, an important matter for their consideration. There was, he observed, one circumstance in the prisoner's favour. She had continued to reside in the house after Mrs. Soames' death, yet this sat uneasily because her own statement that she had seen the deceased take poison in brandy and water. Could she have witnessed such an act, he asked, and remained silent while the woman suffered in great agony in the presence of her children? The jury retired at 1 o'clock to consider their verdict. They did not return until nearly 3. They then returned a verdict of guilty of wilful murder. The learned judge immediately put on the black cap and proceeded to pass sentence upon the prisoner. In passing sentence, the judge observed that the prisoner had been convicted after a long and patient trial, and that the jury had most carefully considered every circumstance of the case. It was not his habit, he said, to comment upon a verdict, but in this instance he could not refrain from stating that, upon the evidence presented, the jury would have failed in their duty had they arrived at any other conclusion. Never, in his opinion, had a case of deliberate murder carried out with prolonged and excruciating suffering under the eyes of the perpetrator been more clearly established. He added that, now that the verdict had been delivered, it was right that the jury and the public should understand the character of the woman upon whom the law had at last laid its hand. He then recounted the earlier incidents brought to light during the inquiry that in 1853 or 54 she was living at Boston with a man named Mower, who died after making his will in her favour, and who was known to take colchicum, a substance with which she was evidently familiar. He referred next to the death of James Dixon, who had died under violent vomiting and purging, although the prisoner had asserted that he succumbed to galloping consumption. The post-mortem examination revealed nothing amiss with his lungs. Then came Mrs. Jackson of Boston, who had withdrawn £120 from the bank shortly before falling ill and dying within 4 days, the money never being recovered, and the promissory note found afterwards proved to be forged. He proceeded to the case of Mrs. Atkinson, attacked with the same symptoms in October 1860 and dead within 4 days. Had the jury acquitted the prisoner on the present charge, she would have been tried for that offence, and having read the depositions, he said he had no more doubt of her guilt than there if he had seen the act committed. Finally, he noted the illness of a man named Taylor in 1861, who was seized with identical symptoms directly after taking his dinner, but who recovered after remedies were promptly administered. Besides that, it appeared in the course the present year she had been tried in this court for the offence of attempting to commit murder by poison, and although she was acquitted, he was informed that the learned judge who tried her believed her to be guilty, and on that account felt his duty to sum up the case very unfavourably for her. He then said that the life of the prisoner was in the hands of the Crown, but he thought right to say that, if any application were made to him upon the subject, he considered the case was one of such character that they certainly should not interfere, and he, therefore, could not hold out to her any hope of commutation of the sentence. His lordship then passed sentence of death in the usual form. The prisoner, who exhibited the utmost coolness and self-possession, was removed from the bar. No serious effort was made to seek a reprieve. The case had gripped the public, and few believed there was any doubt to resolve. In her cell, Catherine Wilson remained withdrawn and unyielding, insisting she was innocent and receiving almost no one despite repeated requests to see her. Her sentence was carried out at Newgate by the hangman Calcraft, marking the last occasion on which a woman was publicly executed in London. From Orr's Kentish Journal, the 1st of March 1862, the execution of Catherine Wilson. On the 20th, Catherine Wilson, who was sentenced to death by Mr. Justice Biles at the last sessions at the Central Criminal Court for the murder of Maria Soames, was executed in front of Newgate. 14 years have elapsed since a woman was executed in Middlesex, and as might have been anticipated, a vast crowd of persons assembled. From Smithfield to Ludgate Hill there was a dense mass of human beings, and at all windows in the Old Bailey from which a view of the scaffold could be obtained were well-dressed people, many of whom had provided themselves with opera glasses, which were levelled at the miserable woman when she came forth from the prison to die. At a quarter before 8 o'clock, a procession consisting of the sheriffs, under-sheriffs, the ordinary of Newgate, the governor and the surgeon went to the bedroom of the convict and then brought her to the room in which the pinioning was to be performed. There she also met Calcraft, who commenced the operation of strapping her arms. Whilst this was being done, she sat on a form and was slightly, but very slightly, agitated. The female warder who accompanied her asked her whether she could do anything more for her, and having been told that she could not, kissed her and left. Mr. Jonas, the governor, then asked her whether she would have some brandy, but she declined. He held a glass of water to her lips and she drank a little, after which he said to her, "The last moment has arrived. Do you wish to say anything?" She replied feebly, "No, I am innocent." She then rose from her seat and followed with unfaltering steps the ordinary, who, as the procession moved across the yard, read the burial service of the Church of England. From the prison she ascended the steps leading to the gallows without betraying any emotion. The white cap was drawn over her eyes, the rope was put around her neck, and her legs were tied. And the bolt having been withdrawn, she fell heavily and died apparently without a struggle. With her death at Newgate, the era of public executions for women in London came to an end. Yet the shadow cast by Catherine Wilson lingered long afterwards. She had walked quietly through the lives of her victims, a nurse, a helper, a companion, and behind her lay a series of deaths that only later aligned into a single devastating pattern. Her story stands as one of the most unsettling examples of how a killer can conceal themselves within the ordinary rhythms of Victorian life, unnoticed, till the pattern finally emerges. Further particulars. A new year, a few old proverbs. For our first episode of the year, we thought it wise to begin with something educational, uplifting, and deeply refined. Naturally, we went straight to the Illustrated Police News. And what better way to welcome 2026 than with a handful of Victorian-era foreign proverbs, those small, portable nuggets of wisdom that travelled further than most Victorians ever did. Some are poetic, some are philosophical, and some sound rather like they were muttered by a disgruntled uncle after the third sherry. Together, they offer a charming reminder that across the world people have always possessed the same basic concerns: unreliable animals, unreliable dinner guests, and the eternal truth that fools require no cultivation whatsoever. So in honour of fresh starts and universal human folly, here are a few favourites from 1890 served exactly as the Victorians liked them: brisk, practical, and occasionally unhinged. From the Illustrated Police News, 11th of October 1890. The well-known warning not to look a gift horse in the mouth has its equivalent in Badag, one of the Indian tongues. If anyone offers you a buffalo, do not ask if she gives milk. And the Malayalam rendering of a burnt child dreads the fire is identical with the corresponding French proverb, a scalded cat fears cold water. Well, the Hindi version is very picturesque and characteristic. He whose father was killed by a bear is afraid of a black stump. Again, we say, if you send an ass on its travels, it will not come back a horse. Which in Tamil runs, you may decorate an ask, but that will not make it a horse. The European proverb that no man is a hero to his valet de chambre, and that familiarity breeds contempt, are tersely and picturesquely combined in the Tamil adage, the temple cat does not fear the idol. Russian proverbs preserves a deep religious feeling and pithy on this coarse expression. A few taken almost at random will illustrate. Measure your cloth 10 times, for you can cut it once. A fool can cast a stone into the sea, but 100 wise men cannot get it out. Fear not the rich man's frown, fear the beggar's tears. No need to plant fools, they grow up themselves. And finally, ask a pig to dinner and it will put its feet on the table. And that brings us to the end of today's cases, a rather sobering reminder that the quietest rooms can sometimes hold the darkest stories. If you've enjoyed the episode, we would be enormously grateful if you could like, subscribe, share and generally waft us in the direction of the YouTube algorithm. Think of it as offering a small lantern to a creature that lives in a cave and only responds to shiny things. And if you'd like to dive deeper, our Patreon has daily drops, all episodes ad-free, and now over 800 documentaries covering Victorian true crime, historical scandals, mysterious Britain, and a good deal more. Full access to the entire archive, all that for a meagre £5 a month. The link is below in the show notes. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, part-time collector of unusually shaped teapots, amateur cataloguer of Victorian umbrella etiquette, and occasional organiser of emergency scone-related response drills. If you've enjoyed your visit to the archives today, do consider joining us again, and of course feel free to tell a friend, a neighbour or unsuspecting pet that this is exactly the sort of channel they've been waiting for. Until next time, very best wishes to all our forensic armchair experts. Stay curious, stay cosy, and we will see you soon.